What does a commander do when the order on his desk contradicts everything the battlefield in front of him is telling him? When obeying may preserve discipline, but disobeying might decide the fate of an entire front in World War II? This question framed George S. Patton's experience of command from the moment he was entrusted with large formations. Because for Patton, orders were never abstract instructions, but living instruments that interacted with terrain, time, morale, and enemy weakness. His reputation as one of the most dangerous Allied generals emerged not from reckless defiance, but from how he interpreted, accelerated, stretched, and sometimes reframed the orders he received under immense pressure. Patton entered World War II with a deeply ingrained belief that war rewarded speed and punished hesitation. This belief had been shaped long before combat by his study of military history and reinforced by his survival within a cautious interwar army. When the United States entered the conflict, Patton understood that his margin for error was thin. His earlier controversies meant that every command decision would be scrutinized not only for results but for conformity. Orders, therefore, became both a shield and a weapon, a shield against accusations of insubordination, and a weapon to justify aggressive action once the shooting started. The first major test of this approach came in North Africa in late 1942, when the U.S. Army confronted the reality that its forces were unprepared for modern mechanized warfare. After the defeat at Kasserine Pass, Allied confidence in American leadership faltered. Patton was given command of II Corps under explicit orders to restore discipline, halt German advances, and stabilize a collapsing front. The orders were clear in intent but vague in method, reflecting both urgency and uncertainty at higher levels. Patton seized on this ambiguity. He imposed rigid discipline, standardized procedures, and reorganized command structures, not because the orders specified these measures, but because he believed they were prerequisites for battlefield effectiveness. The pressure on Patton during this period was immense. Failure would not only jeopardize the North African campaign but confirm doubts about American leadership and his own suitability for high command. Every decision carried institutional consequences. Patton interpreted his orders expansively, using them to justify sweeping changes that exceeded their literal wording. The results were immediate. American units regained cohesion, German advances were checked, and Allied confidence began to recover. The success reinforced Patton's belief that decisive interpretation of orders, rather than literal obedience, was essential under the conditions of World War II. As the campaign progressed into Tunisia, Patton faced a new challenge, operating within a coalition command structure dominated by British leadership. Orders now arrived filtered through Allied politics, compromises, and competing priorities. Patton understood that friction at this level could paralyze operations. His response was to focus relentlessly on execution. When orders emphasized holding ground, he interpreted them as permission to counterattack. When they emphasized coordination, he prioritized speed to preempt German maneuver. Each choice reflected a calculation shaped by uncertainty about enemy intentions and Allied resolve. The invasion of Sicily in 1943 elevated these dynamics to a strategic level. Patton, commanding the U.S. 7th Army, initially received orders that placed his forces in a supporting role to the British 8th Army. The stated objective was unity of effort, avoiding competition between Allied commanders. Patton accepted the orders publicly, but privately he recognized a risk. If American forces remained passive, the campaign could stagnate, allowing German units to withdraw in good order. The pressure to act was compounded by Patton's awareness that his career remained vulnerable to perceptions of recklessness or disloyalty. Patton's response was to interpret his orders in terms of intent rather than limitation. When opportunities emerged to exploit weakly defended routes and seize key terrain, he acted swiftly, framing his movements as necessary to protect Allied flanks and accelerate victory. The dash to Palermo and the subsequent drive toward Messina were not explicit in the original plan, but Patton justified them as consistent with the broader Allied objective of defeating Axis forces in Sicily. These decisions altered the tempo of the campaign, forcing German commanders to adapt under pressure and accelerating the collapse of Axis resistance. The consequences of these actions were complex. Militarily, Patton's aggressive maneuvering disrupted enemy plans and demonstrated American operational capability. Politically, it generated friction with Allied commanders and raised concerns about Patton's willingness to adhere to coalition discipline. Once again, orders became the focal point of debate. Supporters argued that Patton had fulfilled their intent. Critics questioned whether he had exceeded his authority. The ambiguity reflected a broader tension within World War II command structures, where unprecedented operational demands collided with traditional hierarchies. This tension intensified during the campaigns in Western Europe following the Normandy landings. Patton's Third Army was activated at a moment of extreme uncertainty. The Allied breakout from Normandy depended on exploiting a narrow window before German forces could reestablish a coherent defense. Patton received orders emphasizing exploitation, flexibility, and rapid advance, but also constraints related to supply, coordination, and political oversight. The challenge lay in reconciling these competing demands in real time. Patton's interpretation of these orders produced one of the most dramatic operational advances of the war. He pushed his formations forward with relentless momentum, bypassing strongpoints, seizing river crossings, and keeping German units off balance. Each order he issued to his subordinates reflected his belief that delay was the enemy. Yet this aggressiveness carried risks. Supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and coordination with neighboring armies became increasingly difficult. Patton understood these dangers, but judged them preferable to the strategic risk of losing initiative. Pressure from higher command mounted as the advance continued. Concerns about fuel shortages, overextension, and vulnerability to counterattack prompted attempts to rein in Third Army's momentum. Patton responded by adjusting his interpretation of orders yet again, prioritizing maneuvers that maximized operational effect within logistical constraints. When fuel allocations were limited, he concentrated forces for decisive thrusts rather than dispersing effort. These choices demonstrated how orders in World War II were not static directives, but evolving frameworks shaped by battlefield reality. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944 presented perhaps the clearest example of how Patton's relationship with orders could alter the course of the war. When the offensive began, Allied command was caught by surprise. Patton, already anticipating the possibility of a German attack, had prepared contingency plans. When ordered to pivot Third Army north to relieve besieged American forces, he executed the maneuver with unprecedented speed. The order itself was simple. Its execution under winter conditions, enemy pressure, and logistical chaos was anything but. Patton's rapid response disrupted German timelines and relieved pressure on Allied defenses at a critical moment. The decision to trust Patton with this maneuver reflected both confidence in his capabilities and desperation born of uncertainty. Its success reinforced the perception that Patton's command style, shaped by years of interpreting and acting upon orders under pressure, could deliver decisive results when conventional approaches faltered. Throughout these campaigns, the orders that guided Patton were inseparable from the consequences they produced. Each directive carried implicit assumptions about enemy behavior, Allied capacity, and political tolerance. Patton's effectiveness lay in his ability to identify when those assumptions no longer held and to act accordingly, accepting personal and professional risk in the process. World War II forced commanders to operate in an environment where uncertainty was constant and delay could be fatal, and Patton's command exemplified how orders could be transformed into instruments of momentum rather than restraint. As the war progressed toward its final phases, the cumulative impact of Patton's decisions became clear. His interpretation of orders shaped not only individual battles, but the operational rhythm of entire campaigns. The pressure he operated under never diminished. If anything, success increased expectations and scrutiny. Each new order arrived laden with the weight of past outcomes, reinforcing the cycle of uncertainty and consequence that defined his command experience in World War II. As Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the nature of orders reaching Patton's headquarters reflected a war entering its final, most uncertain phase. Strategic objectives were clear in outline but ambiguous in execution. Destroy remaining German field armies, seize key terrain before Soviet forces advanced too far west, and maintain political discipline as victory approached. These overlapping aims created pressure that was different from earlier phases of World War II. The enemy was weakening, but the consequences of miscalculation were potentially enormous, shaping post-war balance as much as battlefield outcomes. Patton understood that late-war orders carried political weight beyond their military language. Instructions concerning lines of advance, boundaries with other Allied armies, and limits on contact with Soviet forces were shaped by diplomatic negotiations occurring far above his level. Yet on the ground, German resistance remained uneven and unpredictable. Some units collapsed immediately, others fought with desperate intensity. Patton's challenge was to interpret orders in a way that preserved momentum without triggering political or coalition crises. His decisions increasingly reflected this dual awareness of battlefield opportunity and strategic restraint. The pressure to conform grew as victory seemed inevitable. High command became less tolerant of deviation, fearing that unnecessary risks could tarnish success. Patton sensed this shift and adjusted his approach, not by abandoning aggressiveness, but by embedding it more carefully within the language of orders. Advances were framed as securing flanks, protecting supply lines, or preventing enemy regrouping. Each operational choice was justified as compliance with intent, even when execution stretched boundaries. This careful framing demonstrated how Patton's command style had evolved through repeated encounters with institutional scrutiny. At the same time, uncertainty did not disappear. German command structures were fragmenting, but isolated counterattacks and localized resistance created constant friction. Orders often arrived based on outdated intelligence, forcing Patton to decide whether to follow them literally or adapt in real time. His experience throughout World War II inclined him toward adaptation. He trusted reconnaissance, forward commanders, and his own operational intuition, using orders as a starting point rather than an endpoint. This approach reduced surprise at the tactical level but increased tension with staffs concerned about coordination. The consequences of these decisions extended beyond immediate military results. Patton's rapid advances liberated territory, uncovered concentration camps, and brought American forces into direct contact with civilian populations under extreme stress. Orders addressing conduct, discipline, and treatment of civilians became increasingly prominent. Patton enforced these directives strictly, aware that violations could undermine Allied legitimacy. His insistence on discipline, often associated with his earlier North African command, resurfaced as a central feature of his leadership, shaped by the understanding that late-war actions would be judged harshly in hindsight. As the German state collapsed, orders related to occupation and transition began to blur the line between combat command and governance. Patton was required to balance the destruction of remaining resistance with the maintenance of order in captured areas. This role exposed new forms of pressure, as military objectives intersected with emerging political realities. His interpretations of these orders revealed both continuity and tension in his command philosophy. Speed and decisiveness remained priorities, but they were now constrained by the need to avoid unnecessary disruption. The uncertainty of this period was compounded by shifting Allied priorities. With Germany nearing defeat, Attention increasingly turned to the Pacific and to post-war Europe. Patton sensed that his relevance within the command structure was changing. Orders became more restrictive, emphasizing stability over exploitation. This transition tested Patton's ability to adapt, forcing him to operate within narrower parameters than those that had defined his greatest successes. The contrast highlighted how context shaped the meaning and impact of orders in World War II. Throughout this phase, Patton's relationship with orders remained transactional rather than reverential. He respected authority but viewed obedience as inseparable from outcome. This mindset had been reinforced repeatedly by the war's demands. Each campaign had demonstrated that rigid adherence could produce failure just as easily as disobedience. The cumulative effect was a command style that treated orders as tools to be interpreted under pressure, rather than rules to be followed without question. As Allied forces reached the heart of Germany, the weight of consequence became unavoidable. Decisions made in hours or days influenced not only the end of the war, but the shape of peace. Patton operated within this environment with the same intensity that had characterized his earlier commands, aware that history would scrutinize his actions through the lens of both military effectiveness and political responsibility. Orders continued to arrive, each reflecting the unresolved tension between urgency and restraint that defined the final months of World War II. This tension ensured that Patton's command remained a subject of debate even before the war ended. Supporters pointed to the consistency of his results under pressure. Critics focused on the risks inherent in his approach. Both views were rooted in how Patton handled orders across the conflict. His career illustrated that in World War II, the power of an order lay not only in its wording, but in how commanders interpreted its intent amid uncertainty, pressure, and the ever-present consequences of action or delay. As occupation responsibilities expanded, the character of orders confronting Patton shifted again, reflecting a military institution transitioning uneasily from combat to control. Directives now emphasized demobilization, disarmament, and the management of displaced populations, tasks for which World War II had offered little precedent. Patton recognized that these orders carried long-term consequences disproportionate to their immediate appearance. Decisions about who governed towns, how former enemy officials were treated, and how quickly normal life resumed would shape perceptions of the American Army long after the last shots were fired. The pressure in this phase was subtler but no less intense, rooted in political accountability rather than battlefield survival. Patton's approach to these orders revealed both continuity and strain. He remained committed to clarity of command and rapid execution, believing that uncertainty bred disorder. Yet the ambiguity inherent in occupation policy challenged his instincts. Orders were often provisional, reflecting unresolved debates in Washington and among Allied governments. Patton found himself enforcing regulations whose rationale was still evolving, requiring a degree of restraint foreign to his combat experience. This tension underscored how World War II forced commanders to operate beyond traditional definitions of warfare, adapting to roles shaped by political uncertainty. The consequences of misinterpreting occupation orders were immediate and public. Incidents that might have been overlooked during active combat now attracted scrutiny from journalists, politicians, and international observers. Patton was acutely aware that his past reputation magnified this attention. Every decision risked being read as a continuation of his aggressive wartime persona rather than a response to new circumstances. This awareness influenced how he communicated intent, increasingly relying on formal channels and documented compliance to demonstrate adherence to higher authority. Despite these constraints, Patton continued to interpret orders through the lens of effectiveness. When directives seemed to slow stabilization or undermine discipline, he sought ways to implement them in a manner consistent with his understanding of order and control. This sometimes brought him into conflict with evolving Allied policies, particularly regarding denazification and civilian administration. Patton's actions reflected the broader uncertainty of the moment, as military leaders navigated a landscape where legal, moral, and strategic considerations intersected without clear hierarchy. The pressure of this environment highlighted a recurring theme from Patton's wartime command: the gap between written orders and operational reality. Throughout World War II, Patton had learned that success depended on bridging this gap without openly defying authority. In occupation Germany, that skill was tested under different conditions. The absence of immediate enemy threat removed the justification of urgency, making deviations harder to defend. Yet Patton's instinct to prioritize stability and momentum persisted, shaped by years of operating under the belief that delay carried its own risks. As Allied command structures adjusted to peacetime priorities, Patton sensed his influence waning. Orders became increasingly prescriptive, leaving less room for interpretation. This shift reflected institutional learning from the war's chaos, an attempt to impose predictability after years of improvisation. For Patton, it marked a narrowing of the space in which his command style could operate. The same qualities that had made his orders decisive in combat now appeared misaligned with the cautious tone of post-war governance. The consequences of this misalignment were not confined to Patton personally. They illustrated a broader challenge faced by World War II commanders transitioning to peace: how to reconcile habits forged under extreme pressure with a new environment defined by political sensitivity and moral scrutiny. Orders in this phase carried the weight of reconstruction, reconciliation, and the emerging Cold War, amplifying the impact of individual decisions. Patton's responses, shaped by his wartime experience, revealed both the strengths and limitations of a command philosophy built for total war. Looking across Patton's entire wartime experience, a consistent pattern emerges in how orders shaped outcomes. From North Africa to Germany, directives served as catalysts rather than constraints, their impact determined by interpretation under pressure. Patton's command demonstrated that in World War II, orders could accelerate victory or complicate alliances depending on how they were applied. The uncertainty inherent in the conflict ensured that no order was ever complete, requiring commanders to supply judgment where clarity was absent. This dynamic left an enduring imprint on how World War II would be studied and remembered. Patton's handling of orders became a case study in the balance between initiative and obedience, a balance forced upon commanders by the scale and unpredictability of the war. His career underscored that the most consequential orders were often those whose meaning was not fixed on paper, but shaped in execution, under conditions where pressure, uncertainty, and consequence converged in real time, leaving open how such decisions should be weighed in the long arc of history.